Okay, welcome back. We're going to get started with our first panel discussion of the day, the ethics of nudges in healthcare. Again, I'm going to refer you to the bio sheets in your folders for our distinguished panelists. And there are a couple of seats still around, but if anybody's having trouble, there is an overflow room in Milstein B where we're live streaming this event. So let me turn things over to Yashar Sagai as our first presenter.
Thank you, Holly, for this very brief introduction. But you omitted a very important fact about me, is that Glenn Beck is actually considering naming me the most dangerous Frenchman in Baltimore. Tough competition, but you've got to start somewhere. Humble and public-spirited proponents of nudges claim that nudges should be part of the regulatory toolbox when they are proven to be. Sorry, you don't hear me? Okay.
To the mic.
Yeah. Okay. So when they are part of the regulatory toolbox and their efficacy is proven. Now, what sets nudges apart from other types of interventions and may provide them with the upper hand over equally efficacious measures, but less restrictive ones, is that they preserve freedom of choice. Thus understood, the argument in favor of the preferability of nudges has three steps. Premise one, all things equal, if two interventions can both efficaciously address a public health issue, the intervention least restrictive of personal liberties ought to be preferred. Premise two, public health nudges are efficacious and preserve freedom of choice. Conclusion, all things equal, public health nudges ought to be preferred to more restrictive interventions. Now, premise two is perhaps the most disputed claim, and several speakers in this conference will scrutinize it. But premise one has often gone unchallenged, and that's the one I want to analyze here. In this presentation, I attack one possible line of defense for premise one. Some argue that premise one is supported by a general principle of public health ethics, stating that public health measures are impermissible unless the public health authorities are in a position to demonstrate they have selected the means least restrictive of personal liberties to achieve their objective. This is, I believe, the view that most public health ethicists espouse under the label principle of the least restrictive alternative or least restrictive means, thereafter PLRA. My argument is that this defense of premise one is based on unwarranted generalization of a principle of constitutional law that adopt narrow PLRA, whose proper and morally justified function is to preserve fundamental liberties and rights and to provide them with enhanced protection, rather than serve as a principle of public health ethics constraining all public health measures. This second understanding of PLRA is what I call broad PLRA. To show this, I will first analyze the meaning and function of narrow PLRA. Second, I present the mainstream model of broad PLRA. Third, I examine three reasons that have been given in order to justify the move from narrow to broad PLRA. I argue that none of them is compelling. And finally, I discuss the implications of my argument for the ethics of public health nudges. The primary source of PLRA is US constitutional law. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights prohibit the government, including public health authorities, from encroaching on fundamental liberties and rights. Now, the constitutional protection is structured through a three-level approach to due process and equal protection. The basic idea is that different liberties and rights trigger different levels of legal scrutiny for the constitutionality. And these three levels of legal review are rational basis review, intermediate review, and strict scrutiny. PLRA is tightly connected to strict scrutiny. Rational basis review demands that the government's goal be a legitimate public interest, and that the means selected be reasonably related to the public health goal. All public health measures have to at least fulfill that requirement. Intermediate review makes higher demands on public health authorities when they interfere with more important interests. They must then demonstrate that their policies serve an important, not merely a legitimate public interest, and the relationship between the means they use and the goals of the policy is substantial, not simply reasonable. The last level is strict scrutiny. Under this standard, the government has to respect PLRA. If a proposed public health measure is challenged on the grounds that interferes with a fundamental liberty or right, the government is required to demonstrate that it has a compelling interest in achieving its public health goal, and that the relationship between means and ends is one of necessity, and therefore the goal, that its goals could not be achieved through less restrictive means. So to sum up, what I shall call narrow PLRA has a highly specific function in constitutional law. It requires the government and its agencies to be in a position to demonstrate that they have selected the least restrictive means just in case they interfere with fundamental liberties and rights to implement their public health goal. Examples of such rights can be cited, rights and freedoms: the freedom of expression and religion, freedom of, from unreasonable search and seizure, freedom of movement, equal protection from discriminatory and arbitrary policies and deprivation of liberty, the right to procreate, protection against laws using a suspect classification on the basis of race, ethnicity, or religion. Now, there are good reasons for accepting a principle of political morality akin to narrow PLRA to constrain the use of the force of public health authorities. The idea that some liberties, such as civil and political liberties, deserve special protection benefits from strong, though not unanimous, support in political philosophy. For instance, in the writings of Mill, Rawls, and more recently Philip Pettit, to name just a few, human rights theory and international human rights law. Let us now turn to broad PLRA. A growing number of prominent public health ethicists cite PLRA in contexts that do not involve the protection of fundamental liberties and rights. From this literature, several models of broad PLRA can be inferred. Here, my focus is on the most widespread model, which is also the most radical. According to this model, PLRA applies to all public health measures. That is, public health authorities must always be in a position to demonstrate that they have selected the least restrictive alternative, no matter whether the liberty or right they interfere with is fundamental or not. A good illustration of this model is the often cited NUFFIELD Council on Bioethics intervention letter. The NUFFIELD Council suggests that the burden of justification and the degree of restrictiveness or intrusiveness co-vary. According to this ladder, the higher the rung on the ladder at which the policymaker intervenes, the stronger the justification has to be. Thus, broad PLRA is embodied in a detailed ranking of interventions, even within the set of non-coercive interventions. Unless policymakers have a compelling reason for opting for more restrictive or intrusive intervention, they ought to use the least restrictive or alternative means. Now, oddly enough, there is scarcely any sustained or explicit attempt at defending broad PLRA in the public health ethics literature. In a nutshell, broad PLRA is assumed to be self-explanatory and self-justificatory. I now propose to critically examine three considerations that have been offered to justify the move from narrow to broad PLRA, but there are some others as well. First, Larry Gustin argues that narrow PLRA is questionable because constitutional law does not offer any clear, compelling, and consensual criterion for demarcating fundamental from non-fundamental liberties and rights. And we can't place any hope in sharpening this criterion in public health ethics, according to Augustine, because liberties are in fact on a continuum. When the continuum of liberties is not acknowledged, certain liberties and rights, such as the right to privacy, might go underprotected. However, the existence of a continuum of liberties that I do not contest does not entail that the difference between liberties is only one of degree, not one of kind. Augustine cannot exclude the possibility of meaningful thresholds along the continuum of liberty. But we certainly need to redraw the fundamental, non-fundamental liberties distinction in a better, more inclusive way, rather than to drop it altogether. Here, the works of philosophers like Mill, Rawls, or Pettit might fuel the reflection of public health ethicists on the best way to rethink this distinction. Second, slippery slope arguments might be appealed to in order to justify the broadening of the scope of PLRA. The worry here is that the state might slowly go from interferences with non-fundamental liberties to interferences with fundamental ones. Broad PLRA would prevent this unfortunate outcome. In this vein, David Resnick suggests that there is no difference in principle between banning artificial trans fats and banning other unhealthy foods, such as processed meats and sugared drinks. Today, trans fats, tomorrow, hot dogs. Resnick claims that interference with food choices matters because it undermines ethnic, cultural, or religious practices associated with food choices. But it is unclear in what sense restrictions on access to fatty and sugary foods undermine the exercise of fundamental liberties and rights that Resnick explicitly mentions as those which matter. The kind of slippery slope that is genuinely worrisome could in principle be avoided by rejecting restrictions that undermine the exercise of those highly protected fundamental liberties and rights. Third, a third justification comes from the Rawlsian notion of reasonable acceptability. In a pioneering and highly influential article on public health ethics, Jim Childress and a group of prominent scholars claim that in a liberal democracy, the justification for coercive policies, as well as other policies, must rest on moral reasons that the public, in whose name the policies are carried out, could reasonably be expected to accept. Childress and colleagues conclude that reasonable acceptability leads to the adoption of a list infringement requirement that they judge, quote, quite similar, end quote, to the requirement of strict scrutiny in US constitutional law. Now, this line of reasoning is also misguided. Why should we conclude that citizens could not be reasonably expected to accept policies that would assign public authorities a higher burden of justification when they interfere with a lighter burden of justification when they interfere with non-fundamental liberties to enhance legitimate or important public health interests? In order to judge whether narrow PLRA is in fact compatible with the Rawlsian requirement of reasonable acceptability or not, we need to unpack this notion. Reasonable acceptability demands that public policies be based on moral reasons that are public reasons. Public reasons are contrasted with reasons rooted in comprehensive conceptions of the good life. Yet, Childress and colleagues offer no argument showing that narrow PLRA is wedded to a comprehensive conception of the good life.
Yes, Shar, we're going to have to wrap up.
Yes, that's my conclusion. To conclude, my argument has two important implications for the ethics of public health nudges. First, the argument in favor of a blanket priority to the use of nudges, if based on broad PLRA, is untenable. Second, the endorsement of some principle of public health ethics akin to narrow PLRA would modify the usual approach to the ethics of nudging. It would require using nudges rather than more restrictive interventions only when a fundamental liberty is at stake and no intervention less restrictive of liberties than nudges is available. In addition, it would imply that public health authorities are not obligated to prefer nudges to more restrictive intervention when their contemplated intervention interferes with non-fundamental liberties. Of course, the use of less restrictive interventions might be desirable on other grounds. I leave this for another day. Thank you.
Next, we have Jennifer Blumenthal-Barbie. Do you need help with your slides? You got it right now.
All right, so as Holly mentioned, I'm Jenny Blumenthal-Barbie. I'm from Baylor College of Medicine, and our project is on incentives as nudges for childhood vaccination in rural India. And this is a paper that I co-authored with two of my undergraduate students at Rice University, Julika and Zainab. And so we are going to tell you about our ethical analysis. So what we did is our study provided an ethical analysis of using a nudge or an influence that predictably alters people's behavior. So we're going to begin by describing a behavioral economics intervention that was conducted in rural India to improve childhood immunization rates. Then we will introduce the integrated ethical framework that we developed to assess this intervention. And finally, we'll present a few selected findings from our ethical analysis. So immunization plays an important role in decreasing child mortality worldwide. However, only 22% of children are immunized against tuberculosis, polio, measles, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus in Rajasthan, a state in western India, and only 2% of children are immunized in the Udaipur district of Rajasthan. So in response to this problem, two MIT professors, Professors Banerjee and Duflo, actually got together and tried to think about how they could use insights from behavioral economics to solve this problem. And so they partnered with Siva Mandir, which was a local nonprofit organization, in 2004 to try to improve immunization rates among the tribal communities surrounding Udaipur. So what they did is they randomized villages into three groups. There was a control group, there was a once monthly sort of default reliable immunization camp, and then there was a once monthly reliable camp with small incentives. And in these incentives camps, what they did is they gave mothers 1 kilogram of lentils every time they brought their children to the camps, and then they gave them a set of steel plates when they completed the immunization course. And what they found is that the incentives group experienced a 6-fold increase in vaccination rates, demonstrating that a small non-monetary nudge could significantly improve health-seeking behavior. So while this was shown to be effective, this incentive-based intervention raised several ethical questions. For example, many of the tribal populations in rural Udaipur visit the bopa, which is a sort of traditional healer to treat illness. So we wondered whether incentivizing the use of allopathic forms of medicine undermined their traditionally held beliefs. We also wondered whether the use of a food incentive was in any way coercive, since more than 40% of households in Udaipur live below the poverty line, making the district among the poorest in India. So to try to answer these ethical questions, we, specifically Julia, went and interviewed 29 of these women in Udaipur last April. And she conducted these interviews using a questionnaire with multiple choice and free response questions at the local immunization camps in the participants' native language. We then, as a group, used these interview transcripts to try to identify common themes regarding the ethics of nudging in this particular case study. Using these themes, we designed an ethical framework that integrates key findings in public health ethics and nudge ethics. So we drew from leaders in public health ethics, such as Childress, Cass, and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and then also leaders in nudge ethics, such as some of the work that Richard Ashcroft has produced on the ethics of incentives and nudging, and some of my previous papers. And there's actually a copy of the framework that we developed in Table 1 in the paper, in case you want to see it in detail. But essentially, the integrated ethical framework had 5 domains: distributive and procedural justice, transparency and trust, respect for autonomy and liberty, utility, and legitimacy. In this presentation, we're going to discuss just a couple of our selected findings from the justice, trust, and autonomy domains. So I'm going to hand over to Julika to talk about justice.
In this section, we assess distributive justice by examining whether the program addresses the participants' vulnerabilities, and procedural justice by evaluating whether the affected parties participated in the decision-making process. We believe that the incentive was distributed according to a Rawlsian view of justice, which prioritizes the well-being of the most vulnerable. The population in this case study exhibits several vulnerabilities, such as poverty, as mentioned previously, limited literacy, geographic isolation, and age. Only 46% of adult men and 11% of adult women are literate in rural Rajasthan, and only 27% of adults have any degree of formal education at all. In addition, due to this population's rural location, the nearest public health facilities are, on average, 10.6 kilometers away from each village. Finally, the primary beneficiaries of this intervention are children, who are by nature vulnerable due to their dependent status. Because of these vulnerabilities, we believe that this population is particularly deserving of any public health interventions that would benefit them. This nudge intervention ensured public participation through a democratic approval process. Before the intervention, Siva Mandir conducted a 1,000 household survey to identify key health problems in the area, and lack of vaccination was described as one of the most pressing issues. Then they held a conference with all stakeholders present, including village representatives and local physicians, to give them an opportunity to express their concerns. Finally, Siva Mandir held a meeting in each community before the intervention began to explain the process and gain approval. Based on these conditions, we believe that this is an exemplary model of the fulfillment of the requirements of procedural justice. In this section, we consider whether trust was built and maintained between parties during the nudge intervention. We found that the traditional birth attendant, or TBA, who reminds the mothers to vaccinate their children, heavily influenced the women's decisions to attend the camps. The TBA is usually a trusted and respected member of the community, and she is actually nominated by the community members themselves. During our interviews, when we asked the women who had influenced their decisions to come to the camps, all of the women mentioned the TBA. We also observed that the women expressed high levels of gratitude for Siva Mandir. Siva Mandir has a 45-year history of building and maintaining trust within the villages in the area, and all of the women we interviewed said they had a positive impression of Siva Mandir. During our interviews, when we asked the women to describe the purpose of vaccination, one woman said, "How should we know? The doctor knows." This quote suggests that the participants do not necessarily feel personally responsible for understanding the risks and benefits of vaccination. Rather, they simply trust those who tell them that immunization is important.
In this section, we consider whether the people who are being influenced are aware of their options and endorse the ways in which their decisions are formed. From our interviews, we found that some factors may have thwarted autonomy. 16 out of the 29 women we interviewed sometimes or never had enough food. This population relies on subsistence farming, so they may lack a reliable source of food when harvests are unsuccessful. There are some studies in psychology that suggest that an unconscious preoccupation with an unmet need such as this one can occupy mental bandwidth. This can result in a myopic focus on the incentive and may prevent the participants from fully considering the risks, benefits, and alternatives of participation. Additionally, the nurses at Siva Mandir are supposed to provide counseling before administering the vaccines. What we found, however, was that only 18 out of 29 of the women received any counseling, and only 12 out of the 29, less than half, knew the correct purpose of vaccination: to prevent disease. We did find, however, that autonomy was protected by certain factors. The incentive did not alienate the women from their traditional values, as we were wondering. The women visited both the Bhopa, or traditional healer, and the government hospital concurrently, showing that allopathic medicine can coexist with traditional forms of care. Additionally, the nature of the incentive was appropriate. The value of the lentils was enough to compensate for the 3/4 day away from work that the women would spend at the immunization camp, but it was not exceptional enough to be coercive. And finally, we believe that the incentive may actually have enhanced autonomy. 26 out of 29 of the women said that vaccination was important to them, and 28 out of 29 said that they do intend to complete the course. However, what we found based on the MIT study, without incentives, only 23% of the women who start their child on the course would go on to complete it. However, with incentives, this increases to 52%. This shows that the incentive helps women to implement behaviors that they would endorse were it not for the natural human tendency to postpone small costs, which we know from our studies of behavioral economics. Also, we believe that in our case, a relational model of autonomy is more applicable because it places value on decision-making within the context of interpersonal relationships. The individual model of autonomy is standard for most ethical analyses, but we found that due to the nature of the local cultures, other parties such as Seva Mandir employees, family members, and also neighbors heavily influence the judgments made by the participants of the program. These people may have acted as just as much of a nudge as the lentils in this case. And when we asked one interviewee why she came to the camp, she said, "In India, we are in one village and we live together, so we come here." This reiterates the collectivism among the population in rural Udaipur. Therefore, in assessing autonomy in collectivist cultures, we propose the use of an approach that addresses the exceptional trust-based compliance that may be unresolved in the individual model of autonomy.
So the last thing that we want to just discuss is this issue of sustainability. This is an issue that arose in our analysis. So sustainability is extremely relevant to the design and implementation of programs related to public health. However, many behavioral economics interventions are discontinued after they prove their effectiveness. So it's sort of a one-time thing to get people to do something, and then there's questions about the long-term effects. In this particular case, Professors Banerjee and Duflo had partnered with Seva Mandir, as we said, and this actually allowed the local organization to develop ownership over the program, increasing the probability that the intervention would be sustainable and maximizing public health benefits. So this was a really sort of admirable example of implementation of a behavioral economics intervention to improve health outcomes. But what we want to do is we believe it's important to differentiate between situations in which not sustaining an intervention causes harm to the populations previously intervened with. For example, if you stop providing an antibiotic and the population develop resistance, and those in which not sustaining the intervention just ceases to continue to benefit the population long term. And obviously, the latter is more ethically acceptable than the former. So we believe that's an important ethical consideration when thinking about using behavioral economics interventions in a public health context. So we conclude that the intervention in this case is ethically acceptable in most of the relevant ethical domains that we analyzed, but the lack of adequate informed consent due to poor counseling is potentially problematic for the domain of autonomy. We also recommend acknowledging the impact of high levels of trust on autonomy in collectiveness communities, such as those in rural Rajasthan, and partnering with local organizations that can sustain behavioral economics interventions that provide public health benefits. So our overall goal in this paper was to articulate and apply an integrated ethical framework that public health officials can use to guide them in the design of their incentive or nudge-based interventions. And that is all for us.
With yellow still on the timer. Good job. Next, we have Nirayal.
Does it work?
Sorry, let me do it for you.
How do I here or?
You can hit enter or you can use the thing.
Okay. Thank you very much, Holly, and thank you, Holly and Glenn, for inviting me to speak and for the exemplary work that the Petrie-Flom Center is doing. Sunstein and Thaler characterize nudges as things that involve no real mandate and yet have potentially a lot of influence on our choices. They are, when they're interesting, they are serving our own good, and they state later, as defined, they want to say, by the person's own informed preferences, not by how some administrator would define what is good for them. And they work for humans, as they put it, not for econs. So it's essential to nudges that they wouldn't work for a rational Homo economicus. They are exploiting our own merely bounded rationality in order to achieve good outcomes. Some nudges, I want to say, are benign in the following sense. Not only is it permissible, all things considered, to use them, or choice whether to use them, there's really nothing wrong with them. There is no serious reason against them. Think of the cafeteria example. You put salad at the entrance of the cafeteria, not the pizza that used to be there. There's nothing to it. It's not like saying, from now on, we won't sell pizza. It's not like saying, for pizza, you'll have to pay some fine, a fat tax, if you want to use it. There's really, which I would probably support in many contexts, all things considered, but there is really no conflict. It's kind of no, as philosophers would put it, no real pro-tanto reason against it in the first place. Think about the retirement nudge. You default people into greater retirement savings. Seems like there is nothing to it. In that way, nudges, they argue, are preferable to the classical paternalistic policies, which are non-libertarian. I want to call the combination of traits that I've described the magic of nudges. They involve no mandate, and yet they have all this influence. They prey upon our cognitive foibles, and yet it's very benign to use them. So what's going on here? We need an account of this magic. And I'm going to rule out some candidate explanations of the magic of nudge, where it comes from, and suggest at the end some explanations that may work better. So let's look at all these characteristics. So here's a very simple account. Some libertarians might say, you've just stated it. The fact that nudges are not mandatory is exactly what makes them permissible to use and not really a problem. I don't have any problem with promoting people's good. My problem was with the constraints, with the mandates. Well, that's not a good account because there are many things that are impermissible in life, even if you think that one of those is mandating things. For example, how about lying to people to achieve their own aims or any other people's ends? How about an example that Sunstein and Thaler discuss? How about blinking kind of frames in the middle of a movie that you don't even notice, manipulate you in a very robust way into not being able to choose anything except Coca-Cola when you next go to the shop? That seems manipulative in a bad way. So that's not enough. So yes, they involve no mandates, but that wouldn't clarify why they are benign. Yashar Sagai has a subtle account in a paper that he didn't discuss today. He says there, when we talk about nudges, the governing value should be the self-determining life. And a life can remain self-determining so long as the broad contours of this life are fully within the control of the person. It's really only rational persuasion that got that person to do them. But with less, with more trivial aspects of the life, it's okay to have a little bit of pressure from outside. And nudges represent this little bit of pressure. It's easy to resist them. We're not talking about something that you can't resist, a huge fine or advertisement that is absolutely effective on you. It's just, I'll have to take 3 steps to the end of the cafeteria to get the pizza, some sort of pressure, and that is something we can live with for something like this cafeteria example. Well, I'll mention 2 challenges for this view if it purports to clarify the magic of nudge. One is, I think we want to accept nudges as benign, even in much more substantial contexts, such as the retirement context, which really affects decades of the person's life. Also, what Sagai is not explaining is why such a small pressure, something that's so easy to resist, has this wide reaching impact on so many people's choices. That is part of the magic that he, I don't think, purported to explain and was not yet explained. So we need to explain it. Here's a very simple account. It says, you know, part of what people want, maybe more than we realize, is to avoid having to change back the default. Oh, sorry, that's a, I'll take that back. That's the next slide. This slide is about the fact that nudges purport to fulfill the person's own informed preferences. Maybe that does it. That's part of the definition. But that, I think, wouldn't explain well why nudges are so much preferable to shoves, because shoves, these classical paternalistic policies which are not libertarian, can also purport and maybe succeed to serve the person's own preferences, as they do in soft paternalism, as they do in Ulysses contracts. What exactly is the advantage of nudges? We haven't heard that yet. So, what if people simply have an aversion, a stronger aversion than we realized, to taking the steps to the end of the cafeteria? That would explain why something that on the face of it looks like such a small incentive actually functions, given its psychological power over us, as a big incentive. We just hate, more than social scientists have realized, to change the default for retirement and fill the forms and all that. And that is what achieves the effect. What is problematic about this account is that it makes things too rational. This is just a price that you pay. It's a greater price than what the social scientists understood. You are very averse to walking to the end of the cafeteria. Maybe you're a hyperbolic discounter or something of that sort. You're eager to get to start eating. But that's a consideration that would present the person affected by the nudge as perfectly rational, so it's not really a nudge because it would work for econs. I think also we should think of this arrangement as a mandate. It's really a fine, if you will, if you think about it properly. So it's like a fat tax. There is a sanction. You want pizza, you'll have to pay something which for you is a pretty dire price if you want to get that. So that's not really what a nudge is. What about what Professor Stanstein shared with us today, choosing not to choose and the potential benefits of doing that? In order for this to count as a nudge, I think Professor Stanstein must say that there is an element here of cognitive failure and preying on that. So maybe something like the inertia that gives us a soft push, a weak push to stay with the default option, is an element of irrationality, of our bounded rationality. But you would have to say, we capitalize on that. We turn it into a heuristic that serves our rational ends and frees us from needing to choose when it's not good for us to choose. I think that's perfectly consistent. If you think about Ulysses' contract again, it can be perfectly liberating even to have oneself tied to the mast. Sometimes things are a little complex in that way. But I'm deliberately using the analogy to Ulysses' contract in order to point out something that I think is still missing in this account as a full explanation of the magic of nudges. In a Ulysses contract, it's not just a default. They will not free you from the mast, even if you beg. So and that is exactly the difference between a shove and a mere default. So if we are to explain the benignness, the special benign nature of nudges, which gives them an edge over shoves, we are not yet there, because we didn't hear an explanation for why keep things as mere defaults. I'll mention now two accounts that may work. One is an account that I'll call manipulative enabling of rational deliberation. So recall that the situation that we're talking about is one where the person's ultimate desire is a healthy one, right? We are talking about, in this book, we're talking about a person who wants, their informed desire is shared by the social planners. They want to be healthy in this case. It's just that they're burdened by this sudden urge, quite strong, to eat pizza, say, in the cafeteria example. I want to say that the use of the manipulative means that work with humans, and I think that pretty much, I agree with Hausman, that pretty much dictates that they are manipulative. This will help us get out of this conundrum. It sparks a weak desire for choosing the healthy option. So you're somewhat reluctant to walk all the way to the end of the cafeteria, gives you some weak desire to get salad instead. Now, it's important that this is merely weak. I'm not saying that the weak desire for not walking to the end of the cafeteria overwhelms the strong desire. That would not be compatible with, that would basically say that we have manipulated you into choosing salad, and we don't want to say that, or that we gave you a strong incentive, like a option that we talked about before. It's a fine or something of that sort. No, it only halts momentarily the fulfillment of the strong urge. And that's important because it gives you a moment to think. You can count to 10. Now you have space to deliberate independently. When you deliberate independently and rationally, thanks to what was irrational manipulation, then you can make a rational decision, and many people, given their fundamental preference for remaining healthy, will choose healthy. So I think that's a very benign account of, and one that does nicely employ the elements of humans, elements of non-shoves, and maybe that would give us an account of the magic. Another account is as follows. I want to say that some forms of manipulation in some contexts are perfectly benign, despite what other essayists would tell you about them. So assume with me that I'm going to give you a bunch of, I think, contentious assumptions, but they are my assumptions. Assume normatively that manipulation, something that would work with humans, not with econs, that even one that frustrates the person's own ultimate desire is benign when it serves the person's own good. It's not totally divorced from what the person wishes for themselves. So it's not like forcing blood transfusion or Jehovah's Witness, something that is so opposed to their core preferences, so diametrically opposed that it would violate their personal integrity if you impose that on them, thinking that it's in their objective good. I'm talking about a less extreme example. And it's not of a brazen sort. That's a very vague notion, but I want to say there, it's not like telling them an outright lie or something of the sort. It's more subtle than that. Assume psychologically that defaults are not so hard to resist. Assume aesthetically, if you will, that mere defaults are not so brazen. On this assumption, I think it follows that a nudge for the person's own good that's kind of compatible at least with her ultimate desire and isn't something like a lie is benign. So if this works, that's also magic. So let me conclude and say that some nudges possess a certain magic. They are non-mandates, but yet they have so much impact on us. They prey our cognitive weaknesses, and yet ethically they remain perfectly benign. I've argued against several accounts of that magic, and I've suggested that 2 accounts may work. I think what we need to do is to scrutinize them critically and see if indeed they do work. Thank you.
And finally, we have Jonathan Gingrich. You can go ahead and go.
If I close this, will the... I'm going to start with what I know is a cliched example, so I apologize for that, but bear with me. Readers find Aldous Huxley's Brave New World creepy and disturbing because of the mind control practiced by the world state. Characters in Brave New World believe that ending is better than mending and that everyone belongs to everyone else, not because they've deliberated about whether it's better to throw away slightly damaged consumer goods rather than repairing them, but because they've been conditioned by being told over and over again as they grow up that ending is better than mending. We find Brave New World revolting not because its subjects are unhappy. In a way, they seem perfectly content, but because of what it does to human agency. Our discomfiture with Brave New World arises largely from how the world state's shaping of its subjects' beliefs displace people's own reasons. Residents of the world state don't fully understand why they do the things that they do. Another way of putting this problem is that the government makes it seem natural and inevitable that the thing to do is to throw away slightly damaged consumer goods. Rather than appearing as a decision that is up to humans, what to do seems like something that is fixed by nature. In Brave New World, rather than doing things for the reasons that they have, people do things because they are conditioned or manipulated into doing things, into doing them, and people start looking less like responsible human agents and more like animals. But there are plenty of cases where it seems perfectly fine for the government to enact laws or policies designed to make people less aware of the reasons that they have for believing or doing things. Consider a city government that wants to make people take fewer short car trips. The city might pass a law stipulating that it constitutes a traffic offense to take a car trip of less than a mile. But the city's traffic administrator might instead nudge people to take fewer short car trips by turning the streets into a grid of one-way streets that it's irritating to take short car trips because of all the turns you have to make to get to your destination. If the city adopts the second policy, it bypasses the moral reasoning of its citizens in a way. If the city adopts the mandate not to take short car trips, people who follow traffic laws are likely to think of themselves as participating in a pattern of activity that residents of the city have agreed to that involves taking fewer short car trips. But if the city sets up a grid of one-way streets, most residents won't think about the broader policy when they take a car trip, and this is why the grid of one-way streets is a more attractive mechanism to reduce the number of short car trips than the blanket prohibition, because it's burdensome to think about your city's traffic policy every time you go to the grocery store. There are many instances in which laws desirably make people less likely to deliberate in one situation, but make people better able to engage in deliberative agency across their whole lives, besides the case of the streets. One rationale for having the FDA is that consumers don't have to spend time deliberating about whether it's safe to buy a can of tomatoes. And it's sometimes better to use legal rules rather than standards because of the clarity of their guidance. Some laws that make people less likely to engage in deliberation are good, not just because they have good effects on welfare that outweigh the costs of less vibrant moral agency, but because they enable people to avoid actively deliberating. There are some cases less extreme, however, than the Brave New World case that still seem morally troubling because of their impact on the realization of people's agential capacities. Consider a city that has 3 high schools, North, Central, and South. The student body of North is 90% white and 10% black. Central High is 55% white and 45% black, and South is 99% black and 1% white. The graduates of these schools, suppose, end up about as financially well off as one another and also end up about as well off as one another on broader measures of welfare, but lead very different lives. Students who attend North and South are likely to end up living in neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by people of their own race, but alumni of Central are more likely to live in racially integrated neighborhoods and to have friends and acquaintances from different backgrounds than themselves. There are exceptions. Sometimes a student who went to South buys a house in a white suburb, but for the most part, the norms hold. The city lets students decide which high school they want to enroll in, but if they don't make a selection, they're enrolled by default in the school closest to where they live, and the city's housing is largely racially segregated. The problem with the school system isn't that it produces unequal welfare outcomes, nor is the problem merely that it makes residential racial segregation likely to continue. The problem is also that the default rule makes it easy for a student to end up attending a school that will significantly impact the whole course of her life without the student actively deliberating about what course she wants her life to take. This interference can also happen in cases of political deliberation. To borrow an example from Cass Sunstein, imagine a state that introduced a method to make voting easier by setting up a system where people can fill out their ballots in advance by indicating that they wish to vote for all the candidates from a party of their choice in all future elections. This system of voting would make it less likely that citizens would engage in periodic deliberation about what political aims their community should have. Citizens don't need to constantly deliberate about politics in order to realize their deliberative capacities, but it is important that they sometimes are encouraged to do so, for instance, by periodic elections. Is it possible to draw a principled line between laws that permissibly undermine the likelihood that people will engage in moral deliberation or fully understand their moral beliefs, and those that do so impermissibly? In the rest of this presentation, I'll argue that laws are immoral when they make people unlikely to engage those deliberative capacities whose exercise is necessary for their functioning as full-fledged humans. To do this, I'll assume that in order to be a fully functioning human being, it's necessary to make decisions about a reasonably wide range of activities. For one's doing to be the product of a decision, one's doing has to be brought about by the apprehension of the reasons that one has for the doing. Making decisions requires that one's actions be responsive to reasons. Otherwise, one's actions don't look like decision-making, but more like picking. An upshot of this requirement on decision-making is that to successfully engage in action-producing moral deliberation, an action must not be merely caused by nature. I don't, for instance, engage in moral deliberation when I breathe because the explanation for my breathing consists of propositions concerning human physiology and the automatic nervous system. There may be exceptional cases, of course, for instance, if I'm breathing into a didgeridoo. We needn't exercise the capacity for deliberation all the time, but it is important that we often engage in this sort of deliberation if we want to realize our complex moral capacities as persons. There are some aspects of life where it is particularly important that we exercise these capacities because in order to realize our unique personalities and make our lives not a piece of the world around us but our own, we have to exercise discretion. Thus, it is important for people to be able to deliberate about and settle on their own conceptions of justice and the good, for instance. A legal system is morally worrisome if it makes people unlikely to realize their deliberative capacities, and it may be particularly worrisome if it makes people unlikely to realize their collective deliberative capacities in deciding how to live together as part of a democratic society. One way in which laws and policies that bypass their subjects' deliberative capacities can go wrong is by failing to be democratic. The possibility of realizing our full human agency is threatened when corporate decision makers make decisions for us non-democratically. The problem with cases of the state that allow voters to vote by default in future elections are that citizens of the state are significantly less involved in making decisions about what to do as a community than is necessary for joint action to which citizens could hypothetically or really consent. In these cases, the laws that get put into place by public officials are so attenuated from any exercise of my agency that I may not be able to regard acting in accordance with the laws as following the reasons that I have for doing the activities that I do. This problem can arise in cases of non-state action, too. Suppose, for instance, that a private employer operating in an environment where there is limited competition for labor nudges its employees into not chatting in the company cafeteria by operating a very fast lunch line with the aim of making it less likely that employees will talk to each other more and agitating for better working conditions or higher wages. Suppose the workers have reason to have lunch together. It's more fun than eating alone, and it might help them to improve their working conditions. But the employer makes it likely that they will instead do as they do not have reason to do. The problem with such policies isn't that they nudge or mandate people to do some activity, but that they're insufficiently democratic, which makes it unlikely that people will be able to endorse the pattern of activity of which they are a part. A second way in which institutions that bypass deliberation can impermissibly undermine agency is through a lack of transparency. When a democratic corporate decision maker makes a decision, but either because of deception or because of a failure to fully disclose facts that inform the decision, even in the case of any bad intent, the subjects of the law or policy can't see the pattern of activity that they're engaged in. Imagine a president who makes it very difficult to understand the actual motivations for a new controversial environmental regulation by intentionally conducting much of the planning for the rule by phone rather than in writing and by invoking executive privilege to avoid disclosing documents when reporters seek to reveal the president's role in shaping the regulation. The lack of transparency in the process of promulgating the regulation might prevent citizens from effectively deliberating about whether or not the regulation is a good idea because considerations that would factor into effective deliberation are not available to them. The same problem might arise not through deception, but through negligence. We can imagine the city traffic planner, for instance, instituting a grid of one-way streets but omitting to make any announcement about the policy's rationale. Laws shouldn't make patterns of activity resulting from political decisions appear to be determined by nature, either through deception or through negligence. These two ways in which laws can go wrong are cases in which laws that displace moral deliberation are harmful to the realization of human agency because of the procedures that are followed in their implementation. Non-democratic and non-transparent implementations of laws prevent me from exercising my agency because the reasons that I have for doing the things that I do aren't in my field of vision. Generally, as long as laws that displace deliberation are democratic and transparent, they're not harmful to human agency. They might, of course, be immoral for other reasons. They could be racist or sexist or defective in any number of ways not directly related to the structure of moral agency. Sometimes it is important that we each independently make uncoordinated decisions about what to do. One significant area in which it's important for individuals to exercise discretion in making decisions is making decisions about who to associate with socially. I set myself up as a particular person with unique orienting projects in large part by deciding to build relationships with some people rather than others. The more generic class of activities where it is important to exercise individual deliberative discretion is those activities that involve the setting up of final ends for oneself or for communities of which one is a part. We might worry about the school assignment case that I described at the beginning of this talk. The default rule that the city has put in place does a great deal to shape who the students are likely to associate with and be friends with over the course of their lives. What default rules should be instituted instead? The law might say that students will be given a choice and that they have to choose before they can begin high school. By encouraging students to actively deliberate about which school to attend, and by helping students understand the likely effects of their choices on the course of their lives, the city can make the effects of school assignments less like an outcome caused by nature and more like an outcome of the students' choices of agents. Law can also interfere with people's deliberation about their final ends more subtly. For instance, a state might nudge its residents into intimate affiliations that take the form of traditional family structures consisting of monogamous opposite-sex couples and their children by making it simple and easy for couples to obtain a large number of benefits through marriage, but only providing those benefits to intimate affiliates whose relationships take less traditional forms through complex and uncertain legal arrangements. The legal defaults in place function to make it less likely that people will deliberate about the sorts of intimate associations that they form, an area of life in which the exercise of discretion is important to the realization of one's personality because of the extent to which one's friends and intimate partners shape one's final ends. To be morally permissible, then, decisions of corporate bodies made for individuals must be democratic, transparent, and not interfere with the morally important exercise of discretion. The line between permissible and impermissible forms of policies that discourage deliberation might be thought of as a line around those areas of life where it is important for individuals to be ethically responsible. In light of this analysis of laws and their relation to autonomy, I'll conclude with some remarks on the political morality of nudges specifically. Many nudges do not meaningfully affect agency, and many are good for agency because they enable people to avoid making choices that they shouldn't have to spend time making. But there are limits on how law can shape the environment in which people exercise their agential capacities. If we assume that the law should make it possible for people to realize their most complex capacities, we should regard action that results from deliberation as the realization of a particularly complex human capacity, and we should recognize certain limits on how we can nudge people. Typically, we can permissibly and sometimes should nudge us, but we shouldn't nudge other people. We should also avoid nudging us if us doesn't understand how us is being nudged. And we should avoid nudging us if doing so undermines our ability as individuals to deliberate about those things, which, as a matter of substantive morality, we ought to exercise discretion.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions now if people want to start lining up in the middle aisle. I will start with a question, and then I'm also going to encourage Yashar and Nir to converse with one another a little bit, as you started to do in the presentation. So my question is for Jenny. One is a caution about the distinction between coercion and undue influence, and in particular, the offer of food as opposed to withholding and entitlement. And then the question relates to how your model would apply to another type of nudge in the research ethics context, which is the incentive payments that are offered to people to participate in clinical research. And what's the difference when we're nudging people towards proven interventions versus experimental trials?
Yeah, so that's good. I mean, so in some of my other work, I've actually been sort of really hesitant for people who want to label all forms of nudging as coercion in a really irresponsible way. And so we actually argue in our paper that generally incentives are not coercive and it's fine, but there was this caveat, which is that there's this sort of literature emerging from psychology that studies where when you prime people to think about something they really need, like you prime poor people to think about, their car breaking down or their rent being due, and then you ask them to do IQ tests, they perform more poorly. And so we just flagged it as a potential concern that if we really worried about people weighing the risks and the benefits of an intervention like vaccination, an incentive could potentially hinder that. And we did see when we asked the women to try to recount to us what the risks and the benefits were, a lot of them had trouble doing that. So that was sort of just potential red flag that we raised. And so then in the research context, yeah, I mean, in terms of offering people incentives and things like that, I would definitely not want to make any blanket statements about that being coercive or anything like that. I'd be very hesitant to do that.
And applying your framework, though, to the research setting?
Yeah, so our framework is an integration of public health ethics and nudge ethics. So I'd have to sort of think about, I think a lot of it would transfer because they're pretty general moral domains, but there might be particular additional domains that we would want to think about in a research context. One, for example, is when we talk about justice, we talk about the consideration of vulnerabilities, and we play that out in our context where the women had certain vulnerabilities due to poverty, et cetera. But people may have additional or different vulnerabilities in a research context, so those might play out a little differently. But I think that the general framework would transfer and help people a lot.
Great. Yashar, did you have any responses to Nir, maybe a little conversation back and forth?
Yes, thank you very much, Nir, for your kind words and also your comments. So I have maybe some follow-up comments on what you said about why do nudges work, but also your comments about self-determination. So first, why do nudges work even if they are easily resistible? I think that's a really important question, and that's unanswered up to now, because the evidence basis for nudges is actually not that thick. What we know is that experimentally, it can be shown that they are efficacious in randomized trials, but we are not sure that they are about their effectiveness, whether they would work elsewhere or not. And we're not sure about the mechanisms that explain why they work. I think all the basics of nudges are unclear. For example, there's a lot of talk about the status quo bias, but what's really the difference between the status quo bias and loss aversion, for example? Which one explains the other? We're not sure. The second point about this is that for some nudges, I think that they are easily resistible, but we do not want to resist them. That's why they work, right? And for others, other interventions based on behavioral economics, I call them prods and not nudges because actually they are not easily resistible. So some interventions of that kind are very hard to resist. For example, there's a study that shows that if you put children's medical exams in a public place in India, there will be competition among fathers who don't want to see their children as the one who are making the worst in terms of medical exams. And that kind of competition, for me, creates so much pressure, social norms, in terms of social norms, that it undermines their ability to easily resist that intervention.
Let me start by just saying how excellent Sagai's article in JME. It's the editor's choice article, and it should have been. I really recommend very strongly reading it. It's a very nuanced discussion of the philosophy behind nudges, very rigorous. And I totally accept Yashar's categories. I think it's a very important category, the category of prods that you come up with, and in addition to shoves and nudges. And regarding these nudges that, as you say, are defined as easily resistible, the evidence is indeed not entirely in, and we don't know how efficacious they are. But what I want to say is, look, there's no magic if they are as efficacious as they are resistible. Did I put this right? Or I think so. There are very little efficacious, and they are indeed very little. I think so. If the point is, if there is any magic, if there is anything to explain, is they need to be at least somewhat more efficacious than you would expect based on how easy it is to go to the end of the cafeteria. And I think the standard should also not be how easy it is psychologically, given sophisticated things about people's psychology. So the point is, if there is anything interesting and anything worth using for policy purposes about nudges, that assumes what I call the magic, in which case there needs to be something more efficacious there than the fine or the size of the incentive, this wouldn't work for econs.
Great, let's go to the audience. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Catherine Womack. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at Bridgewater State, a little bit south of here. My question is mainly for Yashar. It's interesting that you cited Resnick's dire prediction of, the future with no Snickers bars and Coca-Colas once we start down the slippery slope of the trans fat ban. Of course, he was wrong, right? In fact, people hardly noticed the trans fat ban, and it was, sort of taken up quite easily. But they did put their foot down. Many people put many feet down at the proposed big soda ban. There's not enough time to actually go into what was wrong with Bloomberg's big soda ban. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was to talk a little bit more about the context in which a particular nudge occurs. It's not so much the nature of the setup of the particular choice architecture scheme, but one of the reasons why people who look at food policy think that soda bans are so difficult to put into place are because of a lot of different contextual and often localized features about different groups, drinking habits and sort of the way that zoning gets worked with respect to different sorts of venues for selling sodas and for taxes, et cetera, nature of city, county, government cooperation. The Rudd Center talks about this a lot. So maybe you can say something about the importance of taking into account context when considering sort of what interpretation of least restrictive alternative you want to invoke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine, for your question, and I totally agree with you. Actually, that's, I think, the point of my talk is that I'm against a principle of least restrictive alternative that would be generalized so that it would tie the hands of public health authorities so that they could not make decisions that are context sensitive, but they would have to go by this rule and ranking of interventions. And that's what I contest. I think that the way we should go is to make much more context-sensitive decisions. And then factors like those that you mentioned can, of course, tip the balance and make some interventions that, for example, interfere more strongly with what I consider to be non-fundamental liberties be problematic, and they have to be rejected.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julian Urrutia, a PhD in health policy here at Harvard. My question is probably more geared towards the latter two panelists, but I'm happy to hear anybody's answer. One of the sort of magical things about nudges in a certain sense is that a lot of times it's unavoidable to nudge people in one direction or another. So I can imagine that you could design a cafeteria where every item on the menu is equidistant from the point where you go in. But in most cases, you're going to have to arrange it in one way or another. So why wouldn't you arrange it in the way that you think gets people to choose what they ultimately most value? And this idea that you're doing it in their own good is one of the things that you point out as one of the magical things about nudges. And Cass Sunstein has put it very explicitly in the sense that we know that the social environment influences people's choices. We can't dispense with the social environment, then we're justified in manipulating the social environment in the form of choice architecture to get people to choose things that reflect their own values more. But one could take that a step further and say, well, the social environment also influences people's values. And we can't dispense with the social environment, so should we manipulate the choice environment in a way that will change people's values? And I think this gets me in the last presentation in the sense that, well, how do we decide what the right values that we should be manipulating people into acquiring? And who should be making that choice? And why is democratic deliberation necessarily the best way to do it? And as a little add-on to my question about manipulation, and I was thinking about this with respect to Professor Krug's question, well, you might not want to force the person to consider the risks of surgery, but you might inform his wife and manipulate his social environment so that it ends up entering his choice-making context and how these. Thank you.
So I'll address kind of the last part of that question. Thanks for the question. I think, as for the question of how we decide what the right values are to manipulate or what the values are that shape when laws should avoid manipulating people are going to be, I guess one thing is there's going to be a substantive moral question, and the values that you think guide the political community are going to inform when it's okay to nudge people. And so it's going to require filling out something about the significance of, or it's going to require filling out something about why it's valuable for people to make their own choices in certain contexts of choice. And the issue of why democratic deliberation. So I guess I was talking, I saw the requirement of democratic, there being a democratic foundation of nudges as a requirement that it be possible for people to endorse the action that they're engaging in when they do something that they're nudged into doing. And I think that requires that they be able to, if there's a possibility of them deliberating about and trying to change or accepting the nudge, if they see it as something that is, well, if they think that they have reason to do something differently than what they're being nudged into doing.
You're totally right, Julian, that one of the points that I didn't address today, one of the attempts in the book to make sense of the magic of nudge is to say there is no choice except to nudge one way or the other in certain situations or always, and on ought implies can, maybe it has to be benign. I couldn't avoid doing it. You can't accuse me for anything. I want to say about that one that it doesn't work for two reasons. One is, yes, there is a choice. You can nudge more strongly and you can nudge less strongly. You can locate the salad. There is not just two choices, entrance or end. It can also be in the middle. You can have a lottery for how we'll organize the cafeterias for this school, for all schools, and that would have been more neutral, less dictating. Secondly, and more importantly, I think, the same could be said about shoves, about classical paternalism. There are certain situations where you have no choice except to force something on people. So here are two examples. We either, Nora O'Neill gives this one, we either force people to get fluoride in their drinking water, or we force them to either add it on their own or have no fluoride. You have to push people one way or the other. There's no third way. A second example that might be familiar to you because you've done work on prison health is at 11:30, the prison authorities need to decide whether to force everybody to be in their cells or to force everybody to be in the yard, potentially walking around. Might as well take the healthier, pick the healthier option. That's one example where you have no option except to shove people in one direction or the other. So that wouldn't account for what's so special about nudges.
I want to make a brief comment on this sort of, you have no choice but to nudge. I mean, I think that in a certain sense that's true, but I think as Nir said, that you do have a choice about sort of how much to nudge people and what mechanisms to use once we know that some are stronger than others. And I also think one of the examples that I sort of came up with in thinking about this in another paper was, imagine you're riding in the car and someone's controlling the radio, and yeah, they're playing different songs, and the songs that they play are affecting your mood. That's true. They're nudging you. They have no choice. It's inevitable. And you can contrast that, though, with you're sort of riding in the car and someone is intentionally sort of picking certain songs to make you feel more romantic or something like that. And I haven't fully worked it out, but I think that there's something morally significant in the difference between those two cases and the intentionality. I mean, in both cases, yes, you're nudging the person and the person's influenced by what you're doing, but in the latter case, there's a certain element of intentionality, and I think it's interesting and important to think about.
Hi, I'm Nadia Sawicki from the Beasley Institute for Health Law at Loyola Chicago. This question is for Nir. You had suggested that a a nudge would be less ethically justifiable if it were brazen in your terms. And brazen is a very ambiguous and also normatively loaded term. And so I'm wondering if you could expand on the content of that term in such a way as not to essentially break it down into an echoing of our gut sense about the ethical permissibility of one nudge versus another.
Nope. I came up with this 2 days ago, I'm sorry. Good question.
This question is for Yashar Sagai. I'm wondering, so if I understood you, your thesis is that we focused too closely on we've taken a narrow construal of the principle of least what's it called?
Restrictive alternative.
Restrictive, the least restrictive alternatives, and we're generalizing too much. We don't really have an argument for that. That we've taken sort of a constitutional principle or something like that, and we're applying it too broadly. But I wonder whether sort of hypothesis here that maybe it actually works the other way. What we're committed to overall as a society or as individuals is the broad principle. Now, when we're sort of writing the rules, when we're writing a constitution, we have to limit things in a certain way and think about what's really important with respect to the political domain, right? So you can't have a constitution that's 1 million pages long that includes calorie counts on large sodas because it's just crazy to have, right? So you in the political domain, you limit the sort of restrictions that you're willing to discuss. But the narrow construal is just sort of the political concentration of our more broad commitment to just leaving people alone insofar as they don't interfere with anybody else's liberty. Respecting people's autonomy so long as it doesn't impinge on other people's. These sort of general commitments that we have to the value of liberty. So we already have a general commitment. Then it's a question of how public health officials should capture capture that commitment in their health policies. But it actually works the other way. We're committed to the broad principle. The broad principle gets a political identity in the writing of a constitution, but it doesn't work the other way. So I just wonder whether that's a plausible hypothesis and what you might make of that.
Yeah, thank you, Moti. That's a very interesting comment. My sense is that PLRA is essentially a principle of political morality. So as you say, it's really about the relationship between the government and individuals. And there might be other principles that apply to our just the intersubjective domain between us. But I'm not sure that, generally speaking, we would endorse a principle saying that in our interactions, always we have to choose the interaction that's the least restrictive of the personal liberties of other people we interact with. I mean, there are many other moral considerations that are important and that can play a greater role in those decisions than respect for liberty or autonomy. That's why I think that the distinction, the political distinction between fundamental and non-fundamental liberties is extremely important to make. I hope I have answered part of your question at least.
Can I have a follow-up on what you just said, Yashar? Compare two forms of the broad principle of the least restrictive alternative, which a principle that you reject, but I think it comes in two stripes. One is weak and one is strong. The weak one says, it's only other things being equal that we should prefer the least restrictive option. The strong one says, no, we're absolutists. This is less restrictive, and therefore you can't. This is more restrictive, and therefore you can't choose it. When you had premise one on the screen, it said other things being equal. Yeah. So that to me is much more plausible than the strong version. Sure, it's not in basic liberty, but if you can restrict it less and there is nothing to lose, why not be less restrictive? Now I hear you attacking the strong version. You say, what I oppose is people who say liberty above everything else. But that's implausible, I agree with you, but you don't need to state that in order to have the weak version.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my talk, I attack only the weak version, which is the only plausible version, I think, of the argument. And my point is that in terms of political morality and specifically what public health authorities have to do, even if we are in a situation in which all things are equal, they are not required to choose the least restrictive means. They might choose, they are free to choose it, basically, you know, and they could do it for different reasons, but I don't think that there's a moral obligation to do it. And that's, I know, a very strong thesis, and it's counterintuitive, but that's the view I defend.
So we have time for one very quick question before we break.
Okay, on the argument about that everybody has to nudge, I mean, one of the things that's happened since nudge was written was it was originally sort of designed to how to implement policies and make them less restrictive. It has become a rationale for policies. That is, if there are heuristics that people are using and they make mistakes, it's now the reason for a policy. And yet, the distinction ought to be made. The first question is whether or not to have a policy. If you don't have a policy, you don't have to nudge, either strongly or weakly.
So what's going to happen now is that we have lunch set up.